Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Australia is the country of a fair go, not the country of anything goes. When we see the lists of very wealthy companies posted up each year that have not paid any tax at all or paid a pittance, the hackles quite naturally start to go up. Can I borrow that one? A few years ago, an Australian Treasurer, the Honourable Joe Hockey, managed to simplify his party's policies for everyone by suggesting that there were two types of people: leaners and lifters. It was the sort of ugly, divisive worldview that explains why we still see policies like robo-debt. The Coalition are the masters of piling onto people who are already doing it tough. When we turn the gaze to the other side of town, however, we can quite legitimately ask whether a wealthy corporate citizen is also a good corporate citizen. If they are making $1 million or $1 billion and they're not paying their fair share of tax, not funding schools and hospitals, not doing their bit for the very community that they're making money from, then I think we can well identify them as a leaner, can't we? This applies regardless of whether a company is domestic or international, but somehow it rankles with me even more when where it's a multinational not doing its fair share, not pulling its weight. It's like someone you don't even know just showing up at your house and helping themselves to the roses in your front yard. But we do know who the multinationals are, the large ones at least. Technology companies, of course, like Amazon and Apple and Google operate all over the world, as do many mining and manufacturing companies. We know a lot about these companies. We know how much they are valued at, what their assets are, and to a great extent, their annual revenue. And that annual revenue is sometimes quite large. For example, in the case of the advertising revenue of Google and Facebook in Australia last year, the Financial Review noted that Google reported an $8.4 billion in revenue, but only $1.95 billion in Australian revenue, after naming the rest in its reseller arrangements with its international parent company. It paid $92.6 million in income tax. If there's anyone else paying 1.1% in tax, please step forward. Facebook made $1.26 billion, but only $224.6 million in Australian revenue locally after accounting for its own reseller expenses. Facebook paid $42.8 million in tax. That's 3.4%. These are ballpark figures, but you get the idea. They are great tax rates if you can get them. It's not the case, however, that the tax missed out on by the ATO and the Australian community somehow shows up on the ledger of another country. Rather, multinational companies shop around and station themselves in places where they can simply make the most money. The other side of the coin is that communities, not just Australian communities, but communities all over the world, miss out on the tax revenue that they need. Some of these countries are desperately poor. There, the motivation to fix this issue is not so much a question of the fair go, but rather is rooted in a severe need for predictable food, water, housing and essential services. This bill is our response to the OECD and the G20 inclusive framework on domestic tax base erosion and profit shifting. Australia is one of over 135 countries and jurisdictions that are implementing 15 actions to tackle tax avoidance. That list of countries includes China and the USA, Russia and the UK, most EU countries and many poor countries which need their tax base to be firm and not eroded. The OECD notes in its action plan that globalisation has had many good effects. It has boosted trade and investment, supported growth, created jobs and lifted millions of people out of poverty. The OECD also notes that over the decades there has been a trend towards the evasion of just tax payments by multinationals, and that as a result governments are harmed, individual taxpayers are harmed and businesses are harmed. This legislation also acts to improve the competition and dynamism in our economy. How can a new local player enter a realm of business where there is a dominant multinational in place which is hardly paying any tax at all? The new domestic player isn't suddenly going to have a headquarters overseas. They are here and are expected to pay tax here. It is hard enough for a new entrant in technology or in manufacturing or whatever field of commerce, without having to compete on price with the dominant player whose tax burden is tiny compared to yours. As the member for Paterson remarked earlier in their debate, Australians expect everyone to pay their fair share. An economy where new entrants are welcome is a more dynamic, more competitive and a fairer economy. These changes will have useful effects, not just for the revenue base, but in assisting the economy as a whole. The legislation does a couple of useful and reasonable things. In Schedule 1, public companies are required to provide information about subsidiaries in their annual financial reports. Completely reasonable. In Schedule 2, the thin capitalisation rules are amended by replacing the current asset-based test with an earnings-based test, as recommended by the OECD. Totally reasonable. We have, for many years, simply put up with a worsening situation where corporations have been allowed the fiction of moving profits to locations where they have little or no actual activity, and conversely failing to pay tax where their activity is in fact occurring, such as right here at home. The legislation is in the public interest, not just here but across the world. It is, as my friend the member for Bean said, a step in the right direction. Will it result in an act that remains unamended for the next 20 years? I doubt that sincerely. Should we wait until we're sure it is perfect? Absolutely not. We enact this legislation knowing that it is a start to creating a fairer Australian tax system and that there is more work to be done. Some corporations will do the right thing and respond constructively to these parallel and similar legislative changes in many like-minded countries across the world. Others will slide about the globe like a piece of soap, and that will require further action. This legislation was part of the Albanese government's platform going to the election last year. The Australian people voted for this legislation. We have a mandate and a duty to act, and we begin now.